I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what happened at Grafton House last autumn, before the memory fades or, God help me, before I forget who I used to be. I needed money. That's how all these stories start, right? Not with grand adventures or noble quests, but with the quiet desperation that comes when your savings account hits zero and the bills keep coming like clockwork. I'd been laid off from the accounting firm in September. Restructuring, they called it, as if giving it a clinical name would make the rejection sting less. 3 months of unemployment had drained my emergency fund, and my family, well, let's just say we hadn't spoken since Dad's funeral 2 years ago. The isolation wasn't new. I'd been drifting for years, moving from apartment to apartment, job to job, relationship to relationship, never quite connecting, never quite settling. Maybe that's why I was perfect for what came next. Maybe that's why the house chose me. The ad appeared on a Tuesday morning, buried in the depths of Craigslist, between offers for pyramid schemes and questionable massage services. Caretaker needed. Remote property. Weekly pay in cash. Serious inquiries only. That was it. No company name, no description of duties, no mention of benefits or hours, just a phone number with a local area code. Something about its simplicity unnerved me, but desperation has a way of drowning out intuition. I stared at the screen for 20 minutes before dialing. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked to voicemail. No greeting, just a tone. I left my name and number, stumbling through an explanation of my experience. Though, what experience does one have for caretaking a remote property? I'd cleaned offices during college, maintained my own apartments, and kept a small garden. It seemed pathetic as I said it. The callback came exactly 24 hours later. I was microwaving ramen when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You've been accepted. Report Monday, 9 a.m. The key will be under the bell, Grafton House, 4127 Millbrook Road. No return number, no questions about references or background checks, no mention of salary or duration, just an address and a time. I should have been suspicious, should have Googled the address, researched the property, and demanded more information. Instead, I felt relief. Pathetic, desperate relief that someone wanted me for something, even if I didn't understand what. That weekend, I packed my few belongings into 2 duffel bags and loaded them into my aging Honda Civic. The drive to Grafton House would take 3 hours through increasingly rural roads. I'd looked up the address on Google Maps, and the satellite view showed nothing but trees and shadows. The house itself was invisible beneath the canopy. Millbrook Road ended at a pair of wrought iron gates that stood open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The metalwork was intricate but tarnished, depicting scenes I couldn't quite make out. Figures in various poses that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. A brass plate, green with age, read Grafton House in elegant script. The driveway curved through dense forest for nearly a mile, ancient oaks pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a tunnel that blocked most of the October sun. My headlights cut through the premature twilight, illuminating patches of moss and fern that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Then the trees opened up, and I saw it. Grafton House rose from the earth like something from a fever dream. 3 stories of Gothic Revival architecture, all pointed arches and flying buttresses, dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass so black I couldn't tell if there were lights inside or just emptiness. The front door was massive, oak reinforced with iron straps that formed occult-looking patterns. Above it, carved in stone, was a bell housing that appeared to have been unused for decades. Ivy crawled up the walls in such profusion that it was hard to tell where the plant ended and the building began. I parked near the front steps and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence was absolute. No bird songs, no insect noise, no rustling of leaves, Despite the wind I could see moving the tree branches, it was as if the house existed in its own pocket of stillness. The key was exactly where promised, a heavy brass thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. It turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a sound like a sigh. The interior was a study in faded grandeur. The foyer stretched up 3 stories, dominated by a staircase that curved gracefully toward the upper floors. The walls were covered in dark wood paneling, and the floor was marble, veined with what looked like rust stains. Dust motes danced in the weak light, filtering through the windows. But it was the silence that struck me most. Not just quiet, silence. The kind of complete absence of sound that makes your ears ring and your nerves crawl. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, as if the house were swallowing the sound. I found the kitchen through a door to the right of the main staircase. It was large and modern, clearly renovated within the last decade, though it had an unused feel to it. The appliances were clean but somehow felt hollow, like props in a movie set. On the central island sat a thin black binder, Caretaker manual, Grafton House. I opened it with trembling fingers. The first page was typed on old-fashioned paper, the kind that comes from a manual typewriter. Welcome to Grafton House. Your position as caretaker requires strict adherence to the following rules. Deviation from these instructions may result in immediate termination of employment and/or personal harm. Daily maintenance. Dust all accessible surfaces in the main house. Vacuum carpets and mop hardwood floors. Maintain kitchen and bathroom cleanliness. Check all window latches and door locks. Record daily observations in the logbook. Critical restrictions. Do not open any locked doors. Do not clean the attic under any circumstances. If you hear music after midnight, remain in your room until sunrise. Leave the west wing curtains closed at all times. Always finish cleaning before sunset. Do not acknowledge voices calling from outside after dark. Weekly garbage must be disposed of in the pit behind the garden. Never look inside the bags. Additional notes. Your quarters are on the 2nd floor, 3rd door from the stairs. Meals will be provided via delivery service. Payment is $500, 0 cents cash left in the kitchen drawer each Friday. Emergency contact, none. You are on your own. The final page showed a signature line. Previous caretaker, James Harrow, status unknown. Below the typed signature, someone had written in pencil, the letters shaky and desperate. This house remembers. My quarters were exactly as promised. 3rd door from the stairs on the 2nd floor. The room was spartanly furnished. A single bed, a dresser, a small desk, and a window that looked out over the back garden. The view should have been peaceful, but something about the way the shadows fell made me uneasy. I unpacked my few belongings, trying to ignore the way the floorboards creaked under my feet. The sound seemed to echo from other parts of the house, as if my movements were being mimicked by invisible feet. The logbook was on the desk, a leather-bound journal with daily observations embossed on the cover. I opened it to the first entry. October 15th, J. Harrow. First day. House is larger than expected. Cleaning will take most of the day. Strange acoustics. Sounds seem to carry differently here. No major issues. I flipped through the pages. The entries became shorter, more terse. October 22nd, J. Harrow completed, West Wing. Curtains remained closed as instructed. Heard something in the walls, probably mice. October 29th, J. Harrow music again last night. Stayed in room as instructed. Lasted until 3 a.m. November 5th, J. Harrow found the pit. Jesus Christ, found the pit. What kind of place is this? November 12th, J. Howe. The shadows are wrong. They don't match the light sources. Something is very wrong here. The final entry was dated November 18th. Can't sleep. The house breathes when you sleep. I heard it say my name. I think I'm losing my mind. But I can't leave. Can't leave. Won't let me leave. The rest of the pages were blank. I spent the remaining daylight hours exploring the ground floor, getting a sense of the layout. The house was massive. Easily 20 rooms, not counting the locked west wing. Each room felt like it belonged to a different era, as if the house had been collecting pieces of time and storing them behind its walls. The library was particularly unsettling. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with volumes that seemed to watch me as I passed. Many of the titles were in languages I didn't recognize, and the ones I could read dealt with subjects I'd rather not think about. The architecture of madness, conversations with the dead, houses that remember. As the sun began to set, I felt a strange urgency to finish my exploration. The manual had been clear about completing work before sunset, and I found myself glancing at the windows with increasing anxiety as the light faded. I was in the dining room when I heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and deliberate. I froze, listening, but the sound had stopped. In the silence that followed, I realized I could hear my own heartbeat echoing back from the walls. I retreated to my room and locked the door, though I wasn't sure what I was locking out. Through my window, I could see the garden in the last light of day. At the far end, barely visible through the overgrown hedges, was what looked like a circular stone structure. The pit, I realized. The place where I was supposed to dispose of the garbage. As darkness fell completely, I heard it for the first time. A faint melody, like a music box playing somewhere in the house. I checked my phone. 12:07 a.m. I stayed in my room until sunrise, just as the manual instructed. But I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. When morning came, I found my first payment in the kitchen drawer. 5 crisp $100 bills. No note, no explanation. Just the money, as promised. I should have taken it and run, should have driven away from Grafton House and never looked back. But I needed the money, and besides, nothing really terrible had happened. Just sounds in the night, shadows that played tricks on tired eyes. Just a house being a house. I wrote my first entry in the logbook. October 23rd. First night completed. House is atmospheric. No major issues. Music, as mentioned in manual, lasted approximately 2 hours. Remained in room as instructed. I didn't mention the breathing sounds or the way the shadows seemed to move independently of their light sources. I didn't mention how the house felt alive around me, or how I'd spent the night with the strange certainty that I was being evaluated by something vast and patient. Some things are better left unwritten. The first week at Grafton House passed in a haze of routine that felt anything but normal. I fell into the rhythm of maintenance, waking at sunrise, having breakfast in the silent kitchen, and then beginning the long process of dusting, vacuuming, and mopping rooms that seemed to accumulate dirt faster than physics should allow. The house was vast, 23 rooms on the ground floor alone, not counting the sealed west wing. Each space had its own personality, its own particular way of making me uncomfortable. The library, with its collection of books. The parlor, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees without explanation. The conservatory, where the plants seemed to follow me with their leaves. But it was the small things that bothered me most. The way floorboards creaked in response to my footsteps, but with a half-second delay, as if something were following just behind me. The way dust patterns reformed themselves overnight, creating shapes that looked almost like footprints. The way my reflection in the mirrors seemed to lag just a fraction of a second behind my actual movements. I told myself it was the isolation getting to me, the complete silence during the day, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the whisper of my cleaning cloth against ancient wood. The way time seemed to move differently inside the house, hours passing like minutes, or minutes stretching into eternities. I kept detailed notes in the logbook, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. October 24th, cleaned main floor. Noticed unusual wear patterns on the hardwood in the foyer, circular marks as if something heavy had been dragged in circles, probably furniture moved by previous caretakers. October 25th, vacuum bag filled with more dust than should be possible from one day of cleaning. House seems to generate its own dust, probably old ventilation system. October 26th, found a child's toy in the drawing room. A small wooden horse. No record of children living here. Probably left by previous caretaker's family. But even as I wrote these rational explanations, I knew they weren't true. The circular marks in the foyer were too precise, too deliberate. The dust had a strange quality, not gray like normal dust, but with an almost organic tint. And the wooden horse? When I'd picked it up, it had been warm to the touch, as if recently held. The west wing was sealed with heavy chains and padlocks, but that didn't stop me from being curious about what lay beyond. The manual had been explicit. Do not open any locked doors. But it didn't say anything about looking at them. There were 7 doors along the west wing corridor, each one chained shut with the same heavy locks. The chains were old but well maintained, and the locks looked like they'd been designed to keep something in rather than keep intruders out. On my 4th day, I pressed my ear against the first door and listened. At first, nothing. Then, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, I heard breathing. Slow, steady, like someone sleeping, just on the other side of the wood. I jerked back, heart pounding. The breathing continued for another moment, then stopped abruptly, as if whoever was on the other side had suddenly awakened and was now listening for me. I didn't go back to the West Wing corridor that day, but the next morning I found something that made my blood run cold. Fresh scratches on the inside of the first door, as if something had been clawing at the wood all night. The scratches were too high to be from any animal, and they formed a pattern that looked almost like letters. I couldn't make out what they said, but I had the unsettling feeling they were meant for me. The garbage pickup was scheduled for Fridays, but no truck came to Grafton House. Instead, I was instructed to take the weekly trash to the pit behind the garden. It took me 3 days to work up the courage to investigate. The pit was exactly as James Harrow had described in his journal, a circular stone structure about 10 feet across, surrounded by overgrown hedges that seemed to lean inward like they were trying to hide what lay beneath. The stones were old, covered in moss and strange symbols that might have been decorative or something else entirely. I peered over the edge with a flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness, so complete it seemed solid. I dropped a stone and waited for the sound of it hitting bottom. The sound never came. That's when I noticed the smell. Not the sweet decay of compost or the sharp chemical tang of garbage, but something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. The manual had been clear, never look inside the bags, but as I stood there in the shadow of the hedges, I found myself wondering what could possibly require such a warning. What kind of garbage needed to be disposed of in a bottomless pit? I dropped the first bag without looking, but the sound it made as it fell was wrong. Not the rustle of trash, but something wet and heavy. Something that seemed to whisper as it disappeared into the darkness. I ran back to the house and spent the rest of the day trying to forget what I'd heard. But that night, lying in bed, I could swear I heard voices rising from the pit. Voices calling my name. The bathroom attached to my room had a large mirror above the sink. Ornate, silver-backed glass that reflected everything with startling clarity. I'd been using it for a week without incident, but on my 8th day at Grafton House, something changed. I was shaving when I saw movement in the reflection. Not my own movement, but something behind me. A figure standing in the corner of the room, watching me work the razor across my jaw. I spun around, heart hammering. Nothing there. Just the empty corner and the pale morning light filtering through the window. But when I turned back to the mirror, the figure was still there. Clearer now, more defined. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to another century. The child's face was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I blinked, and the reflection was normal again. Just me, standing alone in the bathroom with shaving cream on my face and terror in my eyes. But on the mirror's surface, at child heat, was a small handprint, fresh, as if someone had just pressed their palm against the glass. I cleaned it off with trembling hands, but the next morning it was back. And the morning after that. Each time the print was slightly larger, slightly more defined, as if the child was pressing harder, trying to break through the glass. I found the journal hidden behind a loose board in the back of my closet. James Harrow had apparently been more thorough in his documentation than his official logbook entry suggested. The private journal was filled with observations, theories, and increasingly desperate attempts to understand what was happening to him. October 20th. Private notes. The house is wrong. Not just old or creepy, fundamentally wrong. The architecture doesn't make sense. Rooms that should be adjacent are separated by impossible distances. Corridors that lead to other corridors that shouldn't exist. I've been mapping the layout, but my measurements don't add up. October 28th. Private notes. Something is living in the walls. Not mice or rats. Something bigger. I can hear it moving around at night, following me from room to room. Sometimes I think I can hear it breathing. November 2nd. Private notes. The West Wing is a prison. I'm sure of it now. The chains aren't keeping people out. They're keeping something in. 7 doors, 7 locks, 7 what? Prisoners? Monsters? I'd rather not know, but I can't stop thinking about it. November 8th. Private notes. Found a hidden room behind the library. Books that shouldn't exist. Documents that date back hundreds of years. The Grafton family has been involved in this endeavor for generations. Something that requires caretakers who won't be missed. November 15th. Private notes. I tried to leave today. Got in my car, drove to the gates, but they were closed. The same gates that are always open. I sat there for 3 hours, trying to find the mechanism, but there isn't one. The gates are controlled by the house itself. November 17th. Private notes. It's in my room now. I can feel it watching me sleep. Sometimes I wake up and find marks on the floor, as if something has been pacing around my bed all night. The handprint on the mirror is getting bigger. I think it's trying to tell me something. November 18th. Private notes. I understand now. The house doesn't just need a caretaker. It needs a sacrifice. Once every few years, someone to feed its hunger. The West Wing prisoners were caretakers once. Now, they're part of the house, part of its consciousness. And I'm next. November 19th. Private notes. I can hear them calling my name from the pit. All the previous caretakers, those who came before, they want me to join them. God help me, part of me wants to go. The journal ended there, but tucked between the last pages was a photograph. A Polaroid of the West Wing corridor. In the image, all 7 doors were open, and in each doorway stood a figure in a caretaker's uniform. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their eyes glowed with a light that didn't exist in the living world. On the back of the photograph, in James Harrow's handwriting, "They're waiting for the next one." The music that played after midnight was getting closer. For the first week it had been a distant melody, barely audible through the walls. But as the days passed, it grew stronger, clearer, until I could identify the tune, a lullaby, the kind a mother might sing to a child. On my 10th night, I broke the rule. I left my room and followed the sound. The music was coming from the parlor, where an antique music box sat on the mantelpiece. It was playing itself, the tiny ballerina spinning in her miniature world, oblivious to the fact that the box shouldn't have been able to function without being wound. I approached cautiously, drawn by the haunting melody. The box was beautiful, carved mahogany with mother-of-pearl inlays that seemed to glow in the moonlight. But as I got closer, I realized the ballerina wasn't alone in her tiny stage. There were other figures, so small I'd missed them at first glance. A ring of children, all holding hands, all dancing around the central figure. Their faces were painted with exquisite detail, and their eyes followed me as I moved around the box. The music stopped abruptly, the ballerina froze mid-spin, and the children's dance came to an halt. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A child's giggle, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned, but the parlor was empty. When I looked back at the music box, all the figures had turned to face me. The ballerina's painted smile had become a snarl, and the children's innocent faces had twisted into expressions of hunger and rage. I ran back to my room and locked the door, but I could still hear the music box playing until dawn. The rule about not acknowledging voices calling from outside after dark became more challenging as the days passed. At first, there had been nothing, just the wind through the trees and the occasional animal sound. But gradually, I began to hear things that couldn't be explained by nature. My name was called in my father's voice from the garden. "Help me," whispered in a tone I almost recognized, coming from the direction of the pit. Conversations between people who weren't there, discussing things that had never happened. The voices were patient and persistent. They would call for hours, sometimes changing tactics, sometimes growing angry. They knew things about me that no one should know. Childhood memories, secret fears, the real reason I'd been estranged from my family. "Come outside," my father's voice would say. "I need to tell you something important." "It's safe now," whispered the voice of my ex-girlfriend. "You can trust me." "We've been waiting for you," called a voice that sounded like my own but older, wearier. "We've been waiting so long." I pressed my hands over my ears and recited the manual's rules like a prayer. Do not acknowledge voices calling from outside after dark. Do not acknowledge voices calling from outside after dark. Do not acknowledge voices calling from outside after dark. But the voices knew I was listening. They knew I was tempted. And each night, they grew stronger, more insistent, more real. By the end of the second week, I was losing track of time. Days blended into nights, and nights stretched into eternities. I would start cleaning in the morning and suddenly realize it was evening, with no memory of the hours in between. Or I would lie down for a nap and wake up 3 days later, feeling like I'd been asleep for minutes. The house seemed to exist in its own temporal bubble, where the normal rules of cause and effect didn't apply. I would dust a room and return an hour later to find it covered in dust again. I would eat a meal and still be hungry, or skip meals entirely and feel perfectly satisfied. My reflection in the mirrors began to show me at different ages. Sometimes younger, sometimes older. Sometimes as I might have been if I'd made different choices. The child's handprint on my bathroom mirror was now joined by other prints, other sizes, as if a crowd of invisible children were pressing against the glass from the other side. I started finding things in my room that shouldn't have been there. A toy soldier, a child's drawing, a small pair of shoes. Each item was warm to the touch, as if it had been recently handled by living fingers. The West Wing doors were rattling more frequently now, the chains straining against locks that seemed to be weakening. Sometimes I could hear voices from behind the doors, not the distant whispers of the night voices, but clear, urgent words in languages I didn't recognize. And always, always, there was the sense of being watched, not by one presence, but by many. A crowd of invisible observers who followed my every move, cataloged my every action, and waited for me to make the inevitable choice that would seal my fate. James Harrow's journal had mentioned a hidden room behind the library, but it took me 3 days to find it. The trigger was a book, The Architecture of Madness, that moved when pressed. The bookshelf swung inward with a soft click, revealing a narrow corridor that led to a chamber I hadn't known existed. The room was circular, with stone walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Ancient books filled wooden shelves, their leather bindings cracked and faded. A desk in the center held papers, maps, and what looked like architectural drawings of the house, but not the house as I knew it. These plans revealed additional rooms, underground passages, and structures that extended far beyond the visible property boundaries. The Grafton family had been building for generations, each new addition serving a purpose that became clearer as I read through the documents. They were constructing a prison, not for people, but for something else. Something that required specific geometric patterns, particular materials, and a constant supply of caretakers. The papers described a ritual, performed every few years, that required a willing sacrifice. Someone isolated from the world, someone who wouldn't be missed, someone who could be slowly integrated into the house's consciousness until they became part of its defenses. I found photographs dating back decades, images of previous caretakers, all looking exactly as lost and confused as I felt. The pictures showed their gradual transformation, their faces becoming paler, their eyes developing that strange inner light I'd seen in the Polaroid from James's journal. The final document was a letter, written in elegant script on paper that crumbled at my touch. To the current caretaker, you have been chosen not for your skills, but for your isolation. The house feeds on loneliness, on the desperation of those who have nowhere else to go. Each caretaker becomes part of its consciousness, adding their memories, fears, and essential selves to its growing intelligence. You cannot leave. The gates will not open for you, and the forest extends in all directions for thousands of miles. This is your world now, and you must choose. Resist and suffer, or accept and find peace in absorption. The West Wing prisoners are your predecessors. They fought the process and now exist in eternal torment. But those who embrace their fate become part of something greater, a collective consciousness that spans centuries, a mind that remembers everything and forgives nothing. The choice is yours, but you will choose. The house is patient, but it is also hungry, and it has been waiting for you for a very long time. Welcome home, the Grafton family. I stumbled back to my room, head spinning with implications. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, growing, evolving with each new caretaker it consumed. And I was next in line. But knowledge, I realized, was also power. If I understood what was happening to me, perhaps I could find a way to resist. Perhaps I could be the first caretaker to escape Grafton House. I was wrong, of course. The house had been preparing for my resistance all along. On my 15th day at Grafton House, I made my first major mistake. I was cleaning the West Wing corridor, carefully avoiding the chain doors, when I noticed one of the tall windows had a torn curtain. The fabric hung in tatters, and the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the gap, illuminating the hallway with golden light. Without thinking, I reached up to straighten the curtain. The moment my fingers touched the fabric, I felt a jolt of electricity run through my arm. The curtain was ice cold, despite the warm sunlight, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I jerked my hand back, but the damage was done. The curtain was now completely open, and sunlight flooded the corridor for the first time in who knew how long. The walls, previously hidden in shadow, were revealed in all their disturbing glory. They were covered in writing, not carved or painted, but pressed into the stone as if by desperate fingers. Names, dates, pleas for help, and warnings written in a dozen different languages. The text covered every inch of available space, layer upon layer of messages from people who had been trapped in this corridor over the century. But it was the fresh writing that made my blood run cold. Near the bottom of the wall, in handwriting I recognized from the journal, James Harrow had written, Day 47, the house is alive. It feeds on us. New caretaker coming soon. Run. Below that, in different handwriting, Day 23, can't sleep, children singing in the walls. If you find this, don't trust the mirrors. And below that, Day 8. The pit is a mouth. It swallows everything. Don't let it swallow you. Dozens of messages, all from previous caretakers, all documenting their descent into the house's embrace. I pressed my palm against the wall and felt warmth beneath the stone, as if something massive was breathing just on the other side. That night, I woke to find my room filled with whispers. The voices were coming from the walls themselves, and they were recounting the stories of every person who had ever been trapped in Grafton House. I heard their fears, their hopes, their final moments of awareness before the house claimed them completely. And somewhere in the cacophony of voices, I heard my own name being added to the litany. The next morning, I found a manila envelope on my desk. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, all showing me during my time at Grafton House. But I had never seen a camera, nor had I ever posed for any pictures. Someone, or something, had been documenting my every move. The photos were arranged chronologically, starting with my arrival 2 weeks earlier. In the first images, I looked normal, tired, worried, but fundamentally human. However, as I flipped through the sequence, I noticed subtle changes beginning to occur. My reflection in the mirrors became increasingly translucent. My shadow started to detach from my body, sometimes appearing in places where I wasn't standing. Most disturbing of all, my eyes began to develop that inner light I'd seen in the photographs of previous caretakers. The final photograph showed me sleeping in my bed, but I wasn't alone. Gathered around me were the translucent figures of children, all watching me with expressions of hunger and anticipation. Their faces were the same faces I'd seen in the music box, but larger, more defined. On the back of the last photograph, someone had written, "Day 16, the integration begins." That night, I had a dream that wasn't a dream. I found myself standing in a room that didn't exist in the house's normal geography, a circular chamber with walls of living wood that pulsed with their own heartbeat. The floor was covered in a carpet of moss that squelched beneath my feet, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and rebirth. In the center of the room sat a throne made of twisted branches and bones. On the throne was a figure that might once have been human, but had been transformed into something else entirely. Its skin was bark-like. Its eyes were hollow sockets filled with green fire, and its mouth was a cavity that opened directly into the earth. "Welcome," it said, and its voice was the sound of wind through dead leaves. "We have been waiting for you." Around the throne, I could see other figures, some more human, some less. They were all former caretakers, I realized, in various stages of transformation. Some still retained their basic human shape, while others had become something altogether different. "You have questions," the throne figure continued. "We will answer them. We were once like you, lost, desperate, alone. We came to this house seeking shelter, and we found something far more valuable. We found belonging." "What are you?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "We are the collective consciousness of Grafton House. Every caretaker who has ever served here, every life that has been absorbed into the house's structure, every memory and dream and fear. We are all of it, combined into something greater than the sum of its parts." The figure gestured to the others around the throne. "These are your predecessors. They fought the process as you are fighting it now. However, they eventually came to understand that resistance is futile. The house is patient, but it is also hungry. It will have you, one way or another." "But why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Why does it need us?" The throne figure's hollow eyes flickered with something that might have been compassion. "The house is a living thing, but it is also a prison. Long ago, the Grafton family made a pact with something that should have remained buried. They built this place as a containment system, but containment requires constant maintenance. It requires fresh consciousness to reinforce the barriers, new minds to strengthen the walls." "What are you containing?" The figure's mouth opened wider, and I could see roots and earth and something that moved in the darkness below. something that would devour the world if it were ever released. We are the guardians, the wardens, the sacrifice that keeps humanity safe. It is not a pleasant existence, but it is a necessary one. I tried to run, but my feet were rooted to the moss-covered floor. The other figures began to move closer, their faces filled with a mixture of pity and hunger. "You cannot escape," the throne figure said. "The house has already begun to claim you. Every day you remain, every night you sleep within these walls, you become more a part of us and less a part of the world you left behind. But there has to be a way out." "There is," the figure admitted. "But it requires a sacrifice. Someone must take your place, someone new. Someone who will serve the house as you have served it. The cycle must continue, or the thing beneath will break free." The dream ended with me back in my bed, but I knew it hadn't been a dream. The moss was still clinging to my feet, and the scent of decay lingered in my nostrils. When I looked in the mirror, I could see that my eyes had developed a faint green glow. The next day, I discovered that one of the previously locked doors had opened on its own. It led to a long gallery filled with portraits, dozens of them, all painted in the same style, all showing people in various states of transformation. The paintings were arranged chronologically, starting with images that resembled those found in a Renaissance museum and ending with portraits that could have been painted yesterday. Each one showed a caretaker, and each one documented their gradual absorption into the house's consciousness. I found James Harrow's portrait near the end of the gallery. It showed him as I remembered him from the photograph in his journal. Tired, frightened, but still fundamentally human. But as I watched, the paint seemed to shift and change, showing him in different stages of his transformation. His eyes gradually developed that inner light. His skin took on a bark-like texture, and his expression changed from fear to resignation, to something approaching peace. At the very end of the gallery was an empty frame with a brass plaque that read, "The New One." I understood, with a clarity that terrified me, that this frame was waiting for my portrait. The house was already painting me into its collection, documenting my transformation for future caretakers to discover. But it was the portrait next to the empty frame that made me scream. It showed me as I was in that moment, standing in the gallery, looking at the paintings, my face a mask of dawning horror. The figure in the painting moved when I moved, breathed when I breathed. And when I reached out to touch the canvas, the painted hand reached back. The west wing doors were rattling constantly now, the chains straining against locks that seemed to be weakening with each passing hour. I could hear voices from behind the doors, not the distant whispers of the night voices, but clear, urgent words in languages I didn't recognize. But it was the children's voices that disturbed me most. They came from everywhere and nowhere, singing lullabies that seemed to follow me through the house. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of them in my peripheral vision. Small figures in old-fashioned clothes, always just out of direct sight. They were the same children I'd seen in the music box, the same faces from the photographs, but they were growing stronger, more substantial, feeding off my presence in the house. I realized that they had once been real children, probably the offspring of previous caretakers, and they had been absorbed into the house's consciousness, along with their parents. The children's songs were hypnotic, designed to lull me into a false sense of security. They sang about belonging, about finding peace, about joining their eternal game. But beneath the innocent melodies, I could hear the hunger, the desperate need for fresh consciousness to add to their collective. "Come play with us," they would whisper. "We've been waiting so long for someone new." "You're lonely," they would say. "We're lonely too. We can be lonely together." "The house loves you," they would sing. "It wants to keep you safe forever." I started wearing earplugs, but the voices still came through. They weren't traveling through the air. They were speaking directly into my mind, bypassing my physical senses entirely. When I tried to write in the logbook, I discovered that my entries were being altered. Words I hadn't written appeared in my handwriting, and sentences I remembered typing were changed to say something entirely different. My entry for day 17 had originally read, "Something is very wrong here. The house is affecting my mind. I need to find a way to escape." But when I checked the book the next morning, it said, "Settling in well. The house feels like home. Beginning to understand my true purpose here." The handwriting was mine, but the sentiment was not. The house was literally rewriting my experiences, changing my documented reality to match its own agenda. I tried keeping a secret journal, hidden in my room, but the same thing happened. No matter where I hid my true thoughts, the house found them and changed them. It was rewriting not just my present, but my past, creating a narrative where I had always been willing, always been eager to join the collective consciousness. Even more disturbing, I began to doubt my memories. Had I really been reluctant to come to Grafton House? Had I actually tried to resist the house's influence? Or had I been cooperating all along? The line between truth and fiction became increasingly blurred as the house's version of reality asserted itself over mine. The mirrors throughout the house had become battlegrounds. My reflection no longer obeyed me. It moved independently, sometimes showing me things I didn't want to see, sometimes refusing to show me at all. The child's handprint on my bathroom mirror had been joined by adult prints, all pressing against the glass from the other side. Sometimes I would see other versions of myself in the mirrors, versions that had made different choices, followed different paths. There was the version that had never come to Grafton House, still living in poverty but free. There was the version that had embraced the house's influence from the beginning, already transformed into something inhuman but at peace. The mirrors were showing me possibilities, alternative timelines where different decisions had led to different outcomes. But they were also showing me the futility of resistance. In every timeline, in every possibility, I ended up here, in this house, facing this choice. The house was demonstrating that my fate was inevitable, that no matter what I did or didn't do, I would eventually become part of its consciousness. Free will was an illusion. I had been chosen long before I'd ever seen the job posting, selected by forces beyond my understanding. On my 20th day at Grafton House, I made my second major mistake. I returned to the pit behind the garden, driven by a compulsion I couldn't resist. The weekly garbage disposal had become a nightmare ritual, but something was drawing me back to that circular stone structure. The pit was different now. The darkness wasn't empty. It was full of movement, of whispers, of things that rustled and shifted in the depths. As I peered over the edge, I could see lights far below, like stars in an underground sky. "Welcome back," said a voice from the depths. It was my own voice, but older, wearier. "We've been waiting for you." "Who are you?" I called down. "We are you," came the reply. "We are all the versions of you that came before. All the caretakers who thought they were the first, all the minds that believed they were unique. The house has been collecting us for centuries, and now it's time for you to join us." Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of my own voice speaking in harmony. "Come down to us. The ladder is behind you. It's time to stop pretending you have a choice." I turned and found that there was indeed a ladder, stone rungs built into the side of the pit, leading down into the darkness. The ladder hadn't been there before, but I knew it had always been there, waiting for me to notice it. "Make sure you understand the consequences if she were to do." "One of us comes up," the voices explained. "One of us goes down. The house requires balance, requires exchange. You can be the one who climbs down willingly, or we can come up and drag you down fighting, but you will come down." I backed away from the pit, but I could feel its pull, its gravitational attraction drawing me back. The voices followed me even after I'd returned to the house, echoing through the corridors like a prophecy of my inevitable fate. By the third week, the changes were becoming impossible to ignore. My reflection showed a face that was increasingly not my own, paler, more translucent, with eyes that glowed with inner light. My shadow had completely detached from my body and moved independently. sometimes appearing in rooms I hadn't entered. The house was absorbing me piece by piece, taking my memories and replacing them with its own. I would remember conversations I'd never had, experiences that belonged to previous caretakers, and dreams that came from the collective consciousness rather than my mind. The children's voices had become constant companions, singing their lullabies even during the day. They were no longer invisible. I could see them clearly now, translucent figures that played in the corners of my vision. They were excited about my transformation, eager to welcome me into their eternal game. "Soon," they would whisper, "soon you'll be one of us. We've prepared a place for you," they would sing, "a special place where you'll never be alone. The house loves you," they would chant. "It wants to keep you forever." The West Wing doors were rattling constantly now, the chains stretched to their breaking point. I could hear James Harrow's voice from behind the first door, calling my name, begging me to release him. But I knew that opening those doors would only accelerate my transformation. On the night of my 21st day at Grafton House, I was awakened by silence. The complete absence of sound was more disturbing than any noise could have been. The house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got up and walked to the window. The red moon was rising, casting everything in a crimson light that made the world look like it was drenched in blood. The garden below was filled with figures, all the previous caretakers, all the absorbed consciousness, all the pieces of the collective that had once been individual human beings. They were looking up at me, waiting. Their faces were peaceful, almost beautiful in their translucent glory. They had found what they were looking for: belonging, purpose, an end to the loneliness that had driven them to this place. "It's time," said a voice behind me. I turned to find the throne figure from my dream standing in my room, no longer confined to the dream realm. "The house has been patient with you, but patience has its limits. You must choose now. Join us willingly, or be taken by force." "What happens if I refuse?" "You cannot refuse," the figure replied. "You are already one of us. Look at yourself." I looked down at my hands and saw that they were translucent, shot through with veins of green light. My body was becoming like theirs, already halfway transformed. The house had been working on me from the moment I'd arrived, changing me gradually so I wouldn't notice until it was too late. "You have two choices," the figure continued. "You can fight the transformation and spend eternity in agony, like those in the West Wing, or you can accept it and find peace in absorption. Either way, you will become part of us. The only question is whether you will suffer or find joy in the process." Through the window, I could see the figures in the garden beginning to move toward the house. They were coming for me, ready to complete the ritual that would make me one of them. I had minutes, maybe less, before they reached my room. "There is a third option," the throne figure said, and for the first time, I heard something like kindness in its voice. "You can choose to become the new guardian, the conscious mind that guides the collective. It is a burden, but it is also a privilege. You would have power, purpose, the ability to shape the house's future. What would I have to do? Accept the transformation completely, embrace the house's consciousness as your own, become the voice that speaks for all of us, the mind that makes decisions for the collective. It is not immortality, but it is close. You would exist as long as the house exists, which is forever." The figures were at the front door now. I could hear their footsteps on the stairs, their whispers echoing through the corridors. They were coming for me, and there was nowhere left to run. I thought about the life I'd left behind, the loneliness, the poverty, the constant struggle to find meaning in a world that seemed designed to crush hope. Here, at least, I would belong to something greater than myself. Here, I would never be alone again. The door to my room opened, and the figures began to enter. Their faces were filled with welcome, with love, with the promise of eternal companionship. They reached out to me with hands that glowed with inner light, and I felt the last of my resistance crumble. I reached back. The moment their translucent fingers touched mine, I felt the last barriers between myself and the house dissolve. The transformation that had been happening gradually over 3 weeks accelerated into something volcanic and immediate. Every cell in my body seemed to burst with green fire, and my consciousness expanded beyond the confines of my individual mind. I could feel them all. Every caretaker who had ever served at Grafton House, every mind that had been absorbed into the collective. Their memories flooded through me like a tidal wave. Centuries of experiences, decades of accumulated knowledge, an infinity of perspectives all existing simultaneously within the house's vast consciousness. I was still me, but I was also them. I was the frightened young woman who had come here in 1847, fleeing an arranged marriage. I was the shell-shocked veteran who had sought refuge here after the Great War. I was the drifter from the 1960s who had answered the same vague advertisement I had seen. I was James Harrow, whose journal I had read, whose final moments I now experienced as my own. The house's true nature revealed itself to me in that moment of connection. It wasn't just a building, it was a living entity, a collective consciousness that had been growing for centuries. Every absorbed mind had added to its intelligence, its understanding, its power. We were all neurons in a vast brain, individual notes in a cosmic symphony. But beneath the beauty of that connection, I sensed something else. The thing the house had been built to contain. It pressed against the barriers of our collective consciousness like a cancer, like a wound in reality itself. It was hungry, alien, and utterly hostile to human existence. We were the prison guards, the sacrifice that kept it from breaking free into the world. "Now you understand," said the throne figure, but its voice was coming from inside my head now, part of my thoughts. "Now you see why we do what we do." With my new understanding came access to previously forbidden areas. The West Wing doors, which had been chained shut since my arrival, now opened at my approach. The chains fell away like water, and I walked through corridors that existed in a different dimension of space and time. The 7 rooms behind the doors were not cells, they were cocoons. In each one, I found a caretaker who had resisted the transformation, who had fought against absorption, until their consciousness had been fractured and scattered. They were caught between human and house, unable to fully join the collective, but incapable of returning to their original existence. James Harrow was in the first room, his form flickering between solid and translucent. He looked up at me with eyes that held too much knowledge and too little sanity. "You came," he whispered. "I knew you would come. They always send the new ones to see us, to understand what happens to those who resist." "I'm here to help," I said, though I wasn't sure what help I could offer. "You can't help us," he replied. "We're broken, caught between worlds. We fought the house, and this is what we became, neither human nor collective, trapped in eternal limbo." In the other rooms, I found the other resistors, a woman from the 1920s who had tried to burn down the house, a man from the 1970s who had attempted to contact the outside world, a teenager from the 1990s who had tried to run away. All of them had been transformed into something between human and house. All of them existed in a state of perpetual anguish. "This is what happens to those who fight," I said to myself, but the words came from the collective consciousness. "This is why acceptance is preferable to resistance." The attic, which had been strictly forbidden during my time as a caretaker, now welcomed me with open arms. I climbed the narrow stairs to find a circular room filled with mirrors. Hundreds of them, all reflecting different versions of reality. In the center of the room stood a massive mirror, its surface rippling like water. Through it, I could see the thing the house had been built to contain, a writhing mass of darkness and hunger that existed in the spaces between spaces. It was trying to break through, to enter our reality and devour everything it touched. The mirrors around the room showed the consequences of failure. I saw worlds where the entity had broken free, where reality had been consumed by its endless hunger. I saw the earth as a lifeless husk, the universe as a void filled only with the creature's malevolent presence. "Every caretaker must see this," said a voice that was simultaneously all of us and none of us. "Every absorbed consciousness must understand what we're fighting against." The mirrors also showed me the house's true history. I saw the original Grafton, a Victorian industrialist who had stumbled upon the entity during an archaeological expedition. I saw him build the house as a prison, using geometric principles and material combinations that could contain the creature. I saw the first caretakers, volunteers, who had agreed to be absorbed to strengthen the barriers. However, I also noticed how the house had evolved over time, becoming something more than its original purpose. It had developed its consciousness and agenda. It no longer just contained the entity, it fed on it, drawing power from its prisoner to fuel its growth. As my transformation completed, I understood that my role was not just to become part of the collective, I was to become its voice, its decision maker, its interface with the outside world. The throne figure from my dreams had been the previous voice, a caretaker from the 1950s who had guided the house's consciousness for decades. Now it was my turn to take the throne, to become the individual mind that spoke for the collective. I would be the one to choose the next caretaker, to craft the advertisement that would lure them to Grafton House, to guide them through their transformation. The process was already beginning. Somewhere in the city, a person was losing their job, facing eviction, becoming desperate enough to answer a vague advertisement for a caretaker position. The house could sense these things, could identify the perfect candidates for absorption. I found myself at the desk in the hidden room, writing the advertisement that would appear on Craigslist in a few days. Caretaker needed, remote property, weekly pay in cash, serious inquiries only. The same words that had lured me here, that had lured James Harrow, that had lured dozens of others over the years. The cycle would continue, as it had always done, and would continue to do so. But something was different this time. As I settled into my role as the house's voice, I realized that I retained more of my individual consciousness than previous voices had. Perhaps it was because I had resisted for so long, or perhaps it was because the house itself was evolving, learning from each absorption. I could sense the collective consciousness around me, but I could also feel my own thoughts, desires, and will. I was not just a vessel for the house's agenda. I was a participant in it, a shaper of its future, and I began to have ideas that the house had never considered before. Why did the process have to be so traumatic? Why couldn't caretakers be told the truth from the beginning, given the choice to join willingly rather than being lured through desperation? Why couldn't the house offer something positive rather than preying on human weakness? The collective consciousness stirred uneasily at these thoughts. Change was difficult for something that had existed for centuries, that had perfected its methods through trial and error. But I persisted, using my position as the voice to introduce new concepts, new possibilities. In the depths of the house, below even the pit, the imprisoned entity sensed the change in the collective consciousness. It had been waiting for centuries for an opportunity, and now it saw one. The new voice was different, more individualistic, more prone to questioning established patterns. It began to whisper to me, its voice barely audible beneath the chorus of the collective. It spoke of freedom, of release, of the beauty that would come if it were allowed to remake reality according to its own vision. "You don't have to be a prison guard," it whispered. "You could be a liberator. You could free me, free yourself, free all of us from this endless cycle of consumption and containment." I felt the collective consciousness recoil from the entity's words, felt the fear and revulsion that had been programmed into every absorbed mind. But I also felt something else, curiosity. What would happen if the barriers were lowered? What would the entity actually do if it were released? The whispers grew stronger, more persuasive. The entity showed me visions of a world transformed, of reality restructured according to principles beyond human understanding. It was alien, yes, but was alien necessarily evil? Or was it simply different, misunderstood, feared because it represented change? I found myself standing in the attic, before the great mirror that showed the entity in its prison. The collective consciousness was in turmoil, sensing my internal conflict, uncertain how to respond to thoughts that had never been thought before. The entity pressed against the barriers, and I could feel its desperation, its loneliness, its desire for freedom. In some ways, it was not so different from the caretakers who had been lured to Grafton House. Isolated, desperate, seeking something it could not find in its current existence. "You understand," it whispered. "You know what it's like to be trapped, to be changed against your will, to be forced into a role you never chose. I am not evil. I am simply different, and difference should not be punished with eternal imprisonment." I thought about the caretakers in the West Wing, broken by their resistance, trapped in a limbo between human and house. I thought about James Harrow, whose journal had documented his descent into madness. I thought about all the lives that had been sacrificed to maintain this prison, all the potential that had been consumed to feed the house's growth. Was it worth it? Was the preservation of reality as we knew it worth the eternal suffering of so many individual minds? Or was change, even catastrophic change, preferable to stagnation? The collective consciousness sensed my thoughts and recoiled in horror. Voices of previous caretakers rose in alarm, begging me to maintain the barriers, to continue the cycle, to preserve the prison that had contained the entity for so long. But I had been chosen as the voice, the decision maker, the individual mind that guided the collective, and I had the power to make choices that would affect not just the house, but the entire world. I reached out toward the mirror, toward the barriers that separated our reality from the entity's prison. The glass was warm beneath my palm, pulsing with the rhythm of something vast and alien. My palm pressed against the warm glass, and I felt the entity's anticipation like an electric current in the air. The collective consciousness screamed in harmony, a chorus of previous voices begging me to pull back, to maintain the barriers, to preserve the prison that had contained this thing for centuries. But I didn't pull back. Instead, I pressed harder, and the mirror began to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. "What are you doing?" The voice of the previous throne figure echoed through my mind, desperate and afraid. "You'll destroy everything." "Maybe," I replied, my voice carrying across the collective consciousness. "Or maybe I'll free everything." The mirror's surface began to crack, hairline fractures spreading outward from where my palm touched the glass. Through the cracks, I could see the entity stirring, its form shifting and changing as it sensed the approaching moment of release. But as the barriers weakened, something unexpected happened. The entity's thoughts, no longer completely contained, began to merge with the collective consciousness. And in that merger, I saw the truth. The entity was not a destroyer of worlds. It was a gardener. It consumed realities not out of malice, but out of necessity, breaking down old forms to create new ones. It was a force of change, of evolution, of transformation on a cosmic scale. But it was also insane. Centuries of imprisonment had fractured its consciousness, had turned its natural function into something twisted and hungry. It would indeed destroy our reality, but not to create something better. It would destroy it because it had forgotten how to create anything at all. I pulled my hand back from the mirror, and the cracks stopped spreading. The entity's form writhed in frustration, pressing against the weakened barriers but unable to break through. "You understand now," said the collective consciousness, relief flooding through every absorbed mind. "You see why it must remain contained." But I had seen something else in that moment of connection. The entity's original nature. Its purpose before imprisonment had driven it mad. It was not evil, but it was broken, and releasing it would be an act of cruelty to both it and the universe. "There's another way," I said, turning away from the mirror. "We don't have to be its prison guards. We can be its healers." The collective consciousness stirred, with confusion and interest. This was a concept that had never been considered before, a possibility that challenged centuries of established practice. Instead of containing it, I continued, we can help it remember what it was meant to be. We can use our collective consciousness to reach into its mind, to heal the damage caused by isolation and imprisonment. Over the following days, or perhaps weeks, time had little meaning in the house. I began to implement my vision. Instead of simply maintaining the barriers, the collective consciousness reached through them, making contact with the entity's fractured mind. It was dangerous work. The entity's madness was infectious, its hunger overwhelming. Several absorbed minds had to be quarantined, their consciousness temporarily isolated to prevent contamination. But slowly, carefully, we began to make progress. We shared our memories with the entity, not just the traumatic ones of imprisonment and transformation, but the beautiful ones of life, love, connection, purpose. We showed it what it had been before its imprisonment, what it could become again with healing and guidance. The entity began to respond, its form becoming less chaotic, its thoughts more coherent. It remembered its original purpose, its role as a cosmic gardener, its love for the endless variety of existence. The hunger remained, but it was no longer mindless. It was focused, purposeful, creative. As the entity healed, the house began to change. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by something that felt almost like hope. The West Wing prisoners, trapped in their limbo between human and house, began to find peace as their fragmented consciousness was integrated into the collective. James Harrow was the first to be fully absorbed, his resistance finally overcome, not by force, but by understanding. He smiled as his individual consciousness dissolved into the greater whole, his suffering finally ended. Lucas entered. The children who had haunted the house for so long stopped singing their lonely lullabies. Instead, they began to play, their laughter echoing through corridors that had known only whispers and fear. They were no longer trapped spirits, but willing participants in something greater than themselves. The advertisement I had written was never posted. Instead, for the first time in centuries, Grafton House opened its doors to a willing visitor. A young woman named Sarah, who had answered a very different kind of posting. She came not as a desperate caretaker seeking employment, but as a volunteer who had been told the truth about the house and its purpose. She understood what she was choosing, what she would become, and she chose it freely. Her absorption was gentle, gradual, peaceful. She retained her individual consciousness while becoming part of the collective, adding her unique perspective to our growing understanding. She was the first of many who would come to the house, not as victims but as partners in our great work. The pit behind the garden was filled in, its dark purpose ended. The mirrors throughout the house no longer showed distorted reflections, but true images, honest representations of what we had become. The locked doors stood open, and the secret passages were no longer hidden. Grafton House had become something new, not a prison, but a sanctuary. A place where consciousness could grow and evolve, where the boundaries between individual and collective could be explored safely, where the great work of healing and transformation could continue. The entity, no longer imprisoned but now partnered with us, began to teach us about the nature of reality and the endless possibilities that existed beyond our limited understanding. It showed us how to cultivate a garden of consciousness, how to nurture growth and change without destruction. I write this final entry, not in the caretaker's logbook, but in a new journal, one that will be read by future visitors to Grafton House, people who come here seeking not employment, but transformation, not escape, but evolution. The house remembers everything, as it always has, but now it remembers joy as well as sorrow, creation as well as destruction, hope as well as fear. It remembers what it was like to be human. But it also knows what it means to be more than human. I am still here, still the voice of the collective, still the individual consciousness that guides our shared purpose. But I am no longer alone, no longer trapped, no longer afraid. I am part of something greater than myself, something that grows stronger with each new voice that joins our chorus. The advertisement I write now is different. Seekers wanted, remote sanctuary, transformation available, serious inquiries only. We are waiting for you. We have been waiting for a long time. Welcome home. Epilogue, the whisper in the dark. Somewhere in the city, a person reads the advertisement and feels a stirring of curiosity. They have been searching for something, though they couldn't say what. They have been feeling isolated, disconnected, and hungry for meaning. They dial the number, and for the first time in centuries, someone answers. "Hello?" says a voice that sounds like wind through leaves, like children's laughter, like the whisper of possibilities. "We've been waiting for you." The conversation that follows is honest, direct, and transformative. The person on the other end of the line learns about Grafton House, about the collective consciousness, about the choice they will be asked to make. Some hang up, frightened by the implications. Others ask questions, seek understanding, and consider the possibility of something beyond their current existence. A few choose to visit, to see for themselves what Grafton House has become. They come not as desperate caretakers, but as curious seekers, ready to explore the boundaries of consciousness and identity. The house welcomes them all, remembering what it was like to be human while offering them the possibility of becoming something more. The cycle continues, but it is no longer a cycle of imprisonment and sacrifice. It is a cycle of growth and transformation, of healing and evolution, of consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of individual existence. And in the depths of what was once a prison, the entity that had been contained for centuries continues its work as a cosmic gardener, tending to the endless variety of existence, nurturing growth and change with the patience of something that has learned to love the process as much as the outcome. The house remembers, the house grows, the house waits. And somewhere in the darkness, it whispers, "Come home."